Electrocast.
This week on the Deep Leadership Podcast.
People, especially Gen Z, millennials to a great extent as well, want to be able to be more of themselves at work. They don't want to check those things at the door. They want their companies, in fact, to be involved. They want their CEOs out front weighing in on some of these issues. They want to be able to have an impact in the world, and they want their employers and their managers to be a partner in that impact.
Hi, and welcome to Deep Leadership. I'm your host, John Rennie. Well, I hope all is well with you today, and I am so glad you found this podcast. Now, if you've been listening for a long time, I want to thank you for tuning in each week. The success of this show is because of your loyal viewership. If you're new, welcome aboard. The purpose of this podcast is to build a world with better bosses, and we do this by introducing you to the greatest minds working in the leadership space. Our guests are authors and academics, podcasters and entrepreneurs, business leaders, military leaders, and successful leadership practitioners in a variety of industries, and our goal is to provide you with practical information to help you along your leadership path, whether you're new to leadership or you're a seasoned pro. So thank you for listening in. It's an honor to be your host and leadership guide in this journey. Now, as you know, we could not do this important work without our core sponsors, the Salty Sailor Coffee Company, Leader Connect, and our latest sponsor, Pharaoh Skincare. I highly recommend you check out these companies and give them some love by following the links in the show notes. You can find links to all of my books as well. Now, in this podcast episode, we're talking about how to build an unstoppable workplace culture with two workplace culture experts. Elena Grotto and Felicia Joy are professors at the University of Chicago's Booth School of Business, where they teach students how culture can be a competitive business advantage. Now, one of the most important roles of a leader is to establish and maintain the organization's culture. And as we learn in this episode, that culture can make or break a company. Now, if you've ever wanted to learn how to build an unstoppable workplace culture, this is your episode. So, are you ready to dive in? Let's get started.
Welcome to Deep Leadership. Leadership is a people business. That's the philosophy of your podcast host, John Rennie. As a former Cold War submarine officer who spent 20 plus years leading businesses in corporate America before starting his own manufacturing business, he knows that leadership matters. Are you ready for some real-world actionable advice from John as well as his expert guests?
I'm ready.
The show starts right now.
Welcome to the Deep Leadership Podcast. Today I'm joined by Elena Grotto and Felicia Joy. Elena is an adjunct professor of strategy at the University of Chicago's Booth School of Business, where she co-teaches culture as a competitive business advantage. Additionally, she is the executive vice president and group head of Edelman's business transformation team, working in lockstep with senior decision makers to stabilize the workforce during periods of significant change. Felicia also teaches culture as a competitive business advantage at the Booth School of Business. Additionally, she is the executive vice president of business transformation in Edelman's corporate advisory practice and the head of behavioral science. She has more than 15 years of experience in qualitative and quantitative research, behavioral change strategy, transformation communications, crisis and reputation management, and brand development. Elena and Felicia are co-authors of a brand new book called I Don't Just Work Here, The New Purpose of Workplace Culture, where they help business leaders face the new realities of business culture. Now, I'm excited to have them on the show to learn from their expertise in this subject. So, Elena and Felicia, welcome to the show.
Hey, John, thank you so much. We're really happy to be here.
It's an honor to have both of you on the show. I'm excited about talking about this book. The book is called I Don't Just Work Here, and I love the name of it. So tell us a little bit about the evolving role of leadership in today's workplace, and how do you see the concept of leadership changing? Now we've got a massive amounts of technological advancements. We have AI coming on board. We have workplace shifts, changes. We talked about it before we press record. Post-pandemic, things have changed. So why is culture so important, and what is leadership's role now?
Sure. So, John, the things you mentioned, AI, technological advancements, the pandemic was something that none of us had seen in our lifetime until that happened, and workforce dynamics, so many things changing. But one thing we know for sure in business and as leaders is things will always be changing. So that's something we can expect. But the real difference for leaders now with these changes is an absolute necessary focus on your people in a way that hasn't been true necessarily in organizations in the past. So in the past, there was really this idea that you check your personal opinions and ideas about things happening in society at the door. You come in to do your job, you focus on that job, you collect your paycheck, and you go home. What has changed now is that people are still obviously coming to work to collect a paycheck, but they also, many of them want to do much more than that. They want to have an impact in the world. So what that means for leaders in response specifically to your question is, as leaders, we're not just managing working humans anymore. We're having to manage whole humans. And that means the data is important. The strategy of the business, that's important. Goals are important. Feedback is important. But it doesn't just stop there. Now leaders are not just business leaders, but they're also community leaders in a way within the workplace. And they really have to focus on this whole human to be successful. Elena, anything you would add there?
I would say that as Felicia and I noticed this new expectation of needing to manage whole humans versus working humans, we reflected ourselves that we weren't necessarily taught in our business education on how to manage whole humans. That is a skill set in and of itself. And so in our research, we went and we looked at a few different industries where people actually are taught to manage whole humans. We noticed that in the theological industry and in the community organizing kind of focus area for career tracks, people do receive focused education. And so part of our research was pulling out what are they learning on managing whole humans and how can we translate that into a field guide for managers in the corporate setting to do a quick tune-up on how to manage whole humans. We weren't taught this.
I'm really glad you bring it up because I get a chance to speak to graduate students a lot. And I was teaching at a pretty prestigious school to their international MBA program. It was their last course, their capstone course. And I came in and did a whole day on leadership. And I just asked, I said, like, how many courses have you had on leadership, in this, in your journey, in your MBA journey? And one of the students said, "You're the first one." And I said, wait a second. This is the most important thing that you have to know. You're going to be leading humans trying to do really difficult things. And yet you've learned accounting and marketing and sales and operations and ethics and the legal side of business, but we haven't learned about the people side of business, which is essentially...
John, even what we noticed is there are more and more leadership courses in MBA curricula, but oftentimes they're still focused on managing working humans, how to run a performance review and give feedback on work. But now managers are being expected to have discussions about the emerging contemporary issues of today, of how to navigate people with vastly different political or social beliefs. And they're bringing those to the workplace. And so even leadership of the business, the working human is different than leadership of the whole human.
Okay, well, we barely got the working human part down. So you're saying now we're switching it to the whole human. Oh my goodness! So we're vastly unprepared for this, right? Is that what you're saying generally?
Well, we're saying that this is hard. And what Felicia and I noticed and wanted to do was instead of people throwing their hands up and saying, "I'm just not naturally good at this," that this is a skill. And we wanted to break this down into something where all people can start. And so that's where the research, yes, it found out that this is an insurmountable challenge that we'll all be navigating for our entire careers, but that's not a reason to not try. And so in the research, we did find, really trying to make it quite practical, 7 skills that are necessary to manage whole humans because it is so intimidating and we don't want to throw our hands up. This is our shared work and we can do something about it.
Well, I love this. And I love the fact that you've gone outside of traditional, business to look for places where, where you've had to, manage, where people are doing a really good job, leading the whole human. So can you give us some of that feedback, some of your learnings and maybe some of those 7 key points so that we can sort of get a handle on this? Because I think as soon as you say 1 or 2, we're going to go, that makes so much sense, I would imagine. So give us a sense of what those are.
Yeah, I'll start us here. I'll talk about the one that was most surprising for us, which is the skill of forgiveness. which in talking with community leaders and leaders from the faith community, we learned is absolutely necessary in the work they do because they're accustomed to having conversations where individual values are at the center of those conversations. And when we have values, there's a mindset and there are behaviors attached to those values, but also expectations. And often when conflict happens, it's because someone had an expectation based on their values and someone did something counter to those expectations because they had different values. Because previously in the workplace, people were checking opinions and conversations not related to work at the door, we didn't really have an issue with that. But this issue abounds quite often now because people, especially Gen Z, millennials to a great extent as well, want to be able to be more of themselves at work. They don't want to check those things at the door. They want their companies, in fact, to be involved. They want their CEOs out front weighing in on some of these issues. They want to be able to have an impact in the world, and they want their employers and their managers to be a partner in that impact. So inevitably, in having these conversations, or at least creating space in workplaces for these conversations, or even in doing the work the way that people want to be spoken to and managed and have things communicated, all of that today in this context means that those values come to bear and mistakes will be made. And so we need to get better at forgiveness for when people make those mistakes. We need to be able to show grace and not hold offense. We also, and this is really critical, knowing with you having a military background and some of your listeners having a military background, the mindset of excellence and performance is big in the military. It's big in corporate America. And so sometimes we make a mistake, and as a leader, we can't forgive ourselves. So this forgiveness is not just extended to others, but we also have to get good at forgiving ourselves, because if not, that becomes an impediment to solutions and to progress. And so that was one of the key learnings for us in the research and one of the most surprising skills. Elena, did you want to mention another of them?
The other 6 skills that we noticed, just to offer a little bit of, to complement Felicia's overview of that surprising skill of forgiveness, listening, communicating, persuasion, decision architecture, knowing how to make a good decision, representing others. Today's leaders need to be able to speak about people who are not in the room. And then we mentioned forgiveness, and then what we called almost a super skill is empathy. I know there's been so much discussion around empathy in the business world, but we really saw it as kind of the key unlock for a lot of those other skills as well.
What's interesting about some of these skills is, is that a lot of them we talked about earlier, we don't necessarily learn them in business school, or we don't learn them, but we learn them from our parents, or we learn them from like our mentors, and listen, proper communication, empathy. These things are we do have places where we learn these things, but they're typically not in traditional leadership courses or in typical, like an MBA program or a business leadership program. But so how can people develop these skills, or what's the right approach if they say, look, I recognize there's a shift happening. We have a younger workforce. They definitely want to be, they want to bring their whole selves to work. I want that in an organization. How do you begin, like if you're a Gen Xer like me that grew up in a different time, how do you begin to say, okay, this makes sense. How do I begin to launch some of these things in my organization?
Elena, you want to speak to this?
Sure. What we would say is find a partner. A lot of this work feels scary because it feels like you have to do it and kind of become a perfect graduate of these 7 skills before you go into the workplace to try them. But actually what we found in talking to people who are doing this well, or we also feature several vignettes in our book of people who are learning this, is that they're quite forthcoming about this. We clam up when we try to do it alone. And so we're all trying this. And interestingly, I know that the company where Felicia and I work, we do a study called the Trust at Work study. And what we found in that is that a startling number of employees, 93%, so 9 in 10 of all respondents report that they've been influenced by coworkers in their 20s on a series of topics. So again, I just want to emphasize that stat because it took me a while to even grasp how remarkable this is. It's not that you have to be in Gen Z. It's that 93 of all workers responding to this survey said that they are influenced by the coworkers in their 20s on a series of topics, which means that we really need to leverage the power of Gen Z, your youngest colleagues, in leading this kind of workplace reset, this understanding, this development of powerful workplace cultures. We're watching their expectations, and in many ways, they're leading the charge of this evolved expectations of the workplace. And so I think that we also not just can find a partner that perhaps is at a similar position in their career as ours, but also partner up with someone in the Gen Z cohort to understand some of the motivations and drivers of their expectations of the workplace. Felicia, what would you add?
Yes, John, I would say another key is genuine interest in your people. In business and in leadership, quite often, we are interested in people, but conversations, the opening of conversations that include the casual talk are really to facilitate a quick rapport so we can get on to business. But I would say it makes a phenomenal difference, especially in this context today, because of the influence that Elena was just talking about. If we take a genuine interest in our people, what makes them tick, what their values are, what they think about outside of work, why they're at our organization, why they're on our team. It's been astonishing to me working with our clients and even working with our own team and our direct reports, how just asking someone, where do you see yourself going with your career? Why did you want to work on this project? And what are you hoping to get out of it? Some people in their annual reviews that we've done, or even when they have found a new opportunity and are leading the organization, bring up those questions and conversations as something that impacted them because nobody ever took the time to ask before that. Isn't that astonishing to think about? Just a few simple questions and taking a genuine interest makes that much of an impact on people.
We'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsors.
This episode is brought to you by Men of Grit, Into the Wilderness. The world needs strong men. Are you ready to step up and become the man you were meant to be? Are you ready to face yourself, reject comfort and complacency, and build a legacy of unbreakable strength? Well, from the authors of Jerry Adams and Timothy Regal, both who have been guests on the show, comes Men of Grit, Into the Wilderness, a 40-day challenge to renew your faith, restore your masculinity, and re-energize your family. This book is a call to action to rise up from the couch, embrace your biblical masculinity, and become a strong and powerful man of faith. Are you ready to embrace the challenge and enter into the wilderness? Men of Grit, Into the Wilderness is available on Amazon October 19th. This episode is brought to you by Pharaoh Skincare. I would have never imagined I'd be talking about skincare, but this stuff is truly amazing. Pharaoh is revolutionizing skincare by replacing harmful chemicals with natural ingredients sourced from regenerative farms. Now, weightlifting is tough on the hands, and Pharaoh's Epidermis is the best product I've ever used to get my callous hands back to normal and stay in the game. Now I use it every day. Pharaoh also works to reduce fine lines, wrinkles, and improve overall skin health. As Pharaoh CEO Charles Mayfield likes to say, a little Pharaoh goes a long way. Deep Leadership Podcast listeners can save 15% off all of their products by using the code DEEP at checkout. So check them out at pharaoh.life. That's FARROW.life. This episode is brought to you by the Salty Sailor Coffee Company, the official coffee of the Deep Leadership Podcast. Salty Sailor is a veteran-owned coffee brand on a mission to deliver premium, fresh roasted coffee while making a positive impact in the world. Their motto is drink coffee and do good, which reflects their commitment to making amazing coffee and actively supporting the military community. 10% of every order goes to the Navy Marine Corps Relief Society, an organization dedicated to helping sailors, Marines, and their families in times of need. All our listeners get 10% off every order of their amazing coffee by using the discount code DEEP at checkout. So check them out at saltysailorcoffee.com.
It really does. I mean, we were talking about earlier before I press record, people they want to know that their boss cares. We were talking about names. They want to know that you know their name and you have interest in them. You have curious, you're genuinely interested in them as a person. I think that's something that when I was in corporate, a lot of my businesses I ran did extremely well. And I remember a lot of my peers were like, what are you doing differently? Like, how are you getting the performance you're getting? And I was like, I don't know. Because I couldn't figure it out. But I was doing a lot of things you're talking about, which was like, I spent a lot of time on the shop floor. Because of my background in the military, I was on submarines. And so I was used to being very close with the people I worked with and being, and so I hated being in my office. I preferred being on the shop floor, getting to know my people, letting them get to know me. What were my hopes and desires for the business? What were their hopes and desires in their careers? And so we built this rapport. And as we did that, we connected better and the business became better because they felt like I cared. And I did. But but not only did I care, but they felt like I cared because I was present and I was interested in them. And they hadn't had bosses do that before. So I think, and it was hard to put that in words when my peers said, what are you doing differently? And I'm like, I don't really know. I couldn't really put it in words. I can now later on looking back, but at the time I didn't know what I was doing differently. I was just doing what I learned in the military, which was get to know your people, right? Because these are really important. These sailors, right? My life or death, matter. These sailors matter to my life and death, right? And so I've always felt that way with my employees as well. So it was something I kind of learned in the military, but it seems like we don't do it enough in business. One of the things that you talked about that I thought was interesting is I can't remember. We hit so many other topics there, so I lost my way. But I just the idea of young people. So one of the things, I have a lot of 20-somethings in my business, and what I was going to say is I've heard the term reverse mentoring, where like an older executive would actually get with a 20-year-old and say, what do you see happening and what have you. And I get a lot of energy from the 20-year-olds in my company. They're they haven't seen much of the world. They're not kind of worn down by life's journey. Like I think, as I'm 57, I've had a lot of experiences in my life, and I think it kind of wears you down a little bit. So it's kind of fun to see the optimism and the excitement and the energy and we were at a small company, and I had one of my employees like, oh, I can't believe we're going to be so successful. All the things we're doing, we're going to grow, we're going to be great. And I'm like, okay, so he's getting me fired up, right? I'm like, I'm supposed to be the leader, but I'm like, I'm fired up. Let's go, So I think it is fun to, to not get sucked into like, oh, these young people, what do they know? Instead, just the other side of it is like, they know a lot, and they're bringing so much to the workplace that we haven't seen before, and I love it. So I absolutely love it. So let's kind of turn a little bit into, okay, you've told us a little bit about like why we need to do this and some of the skills that are needed, but how do you put this into a culture? See, culture is kind of interesting, sort of. It's like it's the norms of how we do business, and how do we bring that attitude of treating everyone as a whole person into a culture? How do we create a culture like that?
Sure. Elena, you want to start us here?
Sure. I think the key thing to always keep in mind when designing a culture is that behaviors and values are not business assets unless they ladder up to strategy. So any conversation about culture is really one around business strategy. You don't go around choosing which behaviors sound good. Like a lot of companies will say collaboration and courage and candor. Those only will be valuable in terms of eliciting the business results that are needed if they make sense given the drivers of your business strategy. So I just always want to orient any conversation about how to build a culture as a strategy discussion. But Felicia, do you want to get down to some of the brass tacks? And we're happy to share some examples too.
Sure. So as Elena said, really identifying the values of the organization is critical. Also, understanding the behaviors that advance those values and the strategy. What's really important here, John, is sometimes organizations will declare a particular set of values and behaviors, but there is a disconnect between what is declared and what is done on a daily basis. And whatever is done on a daily basis is actually the values and the behaviors. So if leaders of an organization want these values and they're constantly seeing that the behaviors that are happening within the organization or the results of the strategy don't reflect those values that were defined, then that means there is a disconnect. And so we either need to change to match what we're actually doing, or we need to go back and understand and diagnose why we're not fulfilling the values and the behaviors that we talked about. So for that reason, we think it's really important for the leaders who understand the strategy to create the hypothesis of what they want it to be, the vision of what they want it to be, but to then engage the workforce or a segment of the workforce and employees in talking about, does this make sense for the work that we're doing day to day? Does this feel authentic? Does this feel natural? Or can we be disciplined in building this into our standard behaviors as an organization? You just talked about reverse mentoring. I mean, this is the perfect place for bringing a broad swath of employees from across functions, across roles, across generations into this conversation to make sure that the values that we're putting forward and the behaviors we're putting forward actually make sense and that we're actually going to be able to pull those off. And the one other thing that I'll say is these are things that should be measurable. They're absolutely measurable, and they're tools, and we can talk more about this later if you want to. They're tools for also bringing it down to an individual level, because that's the other failure that can happen, John, is these get established and we talk about it up here as an organization, but we don't get down to day-to-day how this integrates into and drives your work. And I, Felicia, need to understand on a Monday afternoon what it means to be collaborative on a project if I'm working with you or someone else. What does that look like for me as an individual? So you have to talk about it at both the organizational and individual levels.
Yeah, that makes so much sense, because I see a lot of times where we have, corporate sort of saying we're going to have these values, and sort of at a local operation, it's just the opposite. Like
exactly.
you have a toxic boss, and you're like, and it's really discouraging when you're an employee in a company like that. Because I was in one of those companies, which is why I ended up leaving corporate life. I was like, here was the people in charge were saying all these great things, and I'm in a location where there was zero engagement and complete apathy and frustration, and I was like, oh shoot, like it was like a toxic environment. But the top was talking about how great we were going to be, so we didn't execute all the way down to that individual level, like you're saying, and that's a big problem I see when your actions don't match your words. I think you really, it's like doubly discouraging when that.
And that is, John, that's such a important reminder to anyone in a leadership position of actually knowing the sentiment of workers at various segments of the enterprise. The same study I mentioned previously, the Trust at Work data, showed that oftentimes there's maybe 20 plus point difference between what an executive perceives their company is performing on a certain cultural attribute and then the deskless worker. The deskless worker not being about whether you're remote or hybrid, but whether your job doesn't have a desk. These are oftentimes manufacturing employees or frontline workers. And that on the same topic, like how a company is doing on work-life balance or how a company is doing on issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion, the executives will perceive a 20 plus point performance that's better than how the deskless worker would perceive the company performing. So executives, leaders all need to get out and really get into this rhythm of listening and of approaching this as like a co-creation. I have to understand a little bit the true sentiment of the workforce. That's what's those gaps in perception between deskless workers and executives are quite high.
And John, let me just mention that leaders can have the impulse when hearing things like this to say, yeah, I know that's true. We'll get to that eventually or when we can. Or they hear this and say, well, we've invested in some of this and we need to stay focused on the strategy or whatever. Or operations can also tend to be something that they think, oh, we just need to stay focused on operations and not be distracted by these things. We want to say that this is in service of operations. This is in service of strategy. And it can be tempting to not pay attention to it because it can be a lot of work. But the data are so clear on the results and the rewards to companies that do take the time to pay attention to it and do this work. For instance, MIT found in their research that companies with top quartile cultures who do this work well are 25% more profitable. They have fewer safety incidents. They have double the scores on customer satisfaction. They have better retention rates. They even sometimes can get away with paying a little less in salaries because people really value employers who value them and where they see that they can have an impact. So we just can't say enough how it is absolutely worth it to concentrate on this, even though it can seem like a lot of work.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, and I will speak from experiences that, again, I had high performing businesses. And again, it was simple things like just getting to know my people and making sure I treated everyone with respect and listened to them and engaged them and communicated with them often. And it was like I said, night and day, my business compared to my peers' business. And again, I couldn't put it into words, but a lot of the things you're saying are things that I was doing. This was 20 years ago, and so it's really good to know that some of the people skills that I was trying to put in place were some of these things they fit well within what the research now shows, which is great to hear. One of the things I was thinking about is when you build a culture like this, and you really spend time and you do it, and you've got these 7 skills and you're doing it well, and you build a great culture. Obviously, you said the business performs well from a standpoint of profitability, safety, retention, engagement, all those things go up. What about when big changes happen? Because right now we're in a time of constant change. So there's going to be acquisitions, there's going to be technology shifts, there's going to be, I used to talk about, we used to do like 1 project a year when I was in corporate. Well, now the projects are coming 2 or 3 a year, and so it's coming fast and furious. How does a culture that is built with this, again, the way that you described it, how well does that deal with change? And how does it deal with transformations and what have you?
John, we're in a state right now where we are seeing so many companies going through a reduction in force because reorganizations are a part of where we are in this kind of transformation life cycle right now. And as companies reorganize, I think it's actually really interesting to look at how companies can manage something as serious as a reduction in force with these principles top of mind. So I'll give you an example. If a company were going through layoff communications and managing this message to kind of working humans, they might talk about how this was a business decision, full stop, and that would be their messaging. But if you're messaging that same really difficult decision to part ways with some colleagues, and you are messaging this to whole humans, you would think we've seen really it work well to talk about those who were impacted in terms of these are the things we're doing to support them during this transition, to acknowledge that those who are not impacted will have experiences or feelings of survivor guilt, and then to really focus on providing those who are unimpacted, who are still at the company, with a certainty anchor, something that they collectively can focus on to reorient towards the business. Because this is a business decision, and a lot of those 7 skills doesn't mean don't talk about business. Felicia and I are proud that we talk about business so much with our teams, but we try to keep, again, if we're coaching a client through a situation such as a reduction in force, of providing a certainty anchor, like let's focus on the business. Let's understand more about how the financial organization operates, how we're going to refocus and the new operating model will support a more profitable business. That's a certainty anchor. So those 3 touch points of going through a transformational moment, like a reduction in force, by talking about what the support you're providing for those who are impacted, acknowledging survivor guilt, and then providing a certainty anchor that's really laser focused on turning the business, operating in this new model and advancing business success. Those are ways of managing something through this whole human lens. Felicia, what would you add?
Sure. So, John, I really like Elena's very specific example of how we manage through change in doing this work. I want to go zoom out and talk about what happens when this is done well is that you create trust. And trust is a buffer during times of change. And without trust, you don't have that buffer. You don't have any equity with your employees. So what trust enables is people to follow you through the unknown. And that is what is so intimidating and what can create so much fear and paralysis in the face of change is, I know where I am now. We know where we are now. And even if we don't like where we are now, it's still known. And something being known allows for some level of control or perceived control, which is very comforting for employees and people in general. We like to understand things. We like to have clarity. We like to have control. As soon as we start talking about change, there's the unknown. There's a sense of loss of control. But if we have trust, then people are willing to follow you through that period of the unknown to the new certainty that Elena is talking about. You can't get to the certainty oftentimes if they don't even trust you enough to follow because you haven't done certain things prior. So that's why this is so critical, because it creates that trust that gives you that relationship equity and that buffer in the midst of that change.
I cannot speak to how important this issue is, the idea of trust. And the other thing is, you can't build trust at the moment you're about to make a shift and change.
Wow.
That trust is something you've got to build over time, right? So that when it does happen, right, and it will happen, you will go through a crisis, we'll go through a tough time. And so I love that you say that trust is a buffer, and people are willing to follow you through the unknown. If you've built up that trust, if they've seen you in times in the past and how you acted, and they trust that you're going to do the right thing. And so we get the benefit of the doubt if we've built up that trust. But you can't do that, a week before you're about to make a bad announcement, right?
Yeah, but trust is also trust is something we give. I mean, you feel if you trust someone, they will trust you. There's this reciprocity at play. And so a lot of times when we're looking at a situation or a relationship where it feels like there isn't trust, it oftentimes might start with us questioning, do we even trust them? And so there's a role that we can all play in building this reciprocity that's core to trust.
This has been such a fantastic conversation. And I apologize to both of you because I wrote questions and I had a script and I went way off it. And you handled every curveball perfectly. And I love it. It was such a great discussion. What final message would you like to leave with our listeners about this really important topic?
I would say don't confuse small with insignificant when it comes to culture change. It can feel overwhelming, but sometimes small changes really start to feel big within this vast journey that we're on in managing whole humans. Felicia, what would you add?
I would add that as leaders, sometimes we make things very complex. And with culture, these are trainable skills. And we need to make sure that we've done the basics well. So I like to think about basketball. At its simplest, it's putting a round ball in a round hoop. It's just that simple to put points on the board. So from a culture perspective, what are your real values? What are your real behaviors? How do we implement those with leaders and employees? And then demonstrate those in our work every day. Very simple. If we do that and take care of our people, then the rest of it is going to take care of itself.
Powerful, powerful leaders. I hope that you are listening to this. You're in your car right now. You're screaming yes, and you're like, yes, I need to work on this. This is great, because I know for me, it's getting me fired up. And I get excited when I hear that, especially when I hear that the research backs up a lot of the things that I feel like need to happen and should happen in business and are effective in business. So it's good to hear that it does work. And you're working with big companies that are making these changes, and it's exciting to hear. So congratulations on the book so far. And again, I think it's a powerful message that you're giving to your readers and to the listeners of this podcast. How can our listeners find out more about the both of you, your company, and this new book?
Sure. They can find out about us at joygrotto.com, JOYGROTTO.com. And also they can learn more about the company we work for, Edelman, at edelman.com. We're also on LinkedIn, and they can just search our names, Felicia Joy and Elena Grotto. Thank you so much for this opportunity.
Fantastic. And we're going to go ahead and put links in the show notes for all of their resources because it's such an important issue. Culture is such an important part of business. And if you're not working on it, if you're not thinking about it, if you're not making an impact on it, when you need it, you're not going to have it. And so I think it's something you need to be working on every day. Elena, Felicia, thank you so much for coming on the show. Thank you for the work that you're doing and this book that you've written. Such an important book. And I really appreciate you coming and sharing your expertise on the podcast.
Thank you.
Thank you, John.
Thank you. Well, that's it for today. Thank you for listening to Deep Leadership. If you like this podcast, please subscribe and share so we can continue to build a world with better bosses. Until next time, this is John Rennie saying take care and lead well.
Thank you for listening to Deep Leadership.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, thank you, thank you for all you do.
We hope you enjoyed today's episode. For more information and updates, please visit our website at www.deepleadershippodcast.com or johnsrennie.com. Until next time, take care.
Have you ever wondered what actually happens in Congress every day? Stay informed on Capitol Hill's daily happenings with a concise, factual summary of the Senate and House of Representatives' activities from the previous session, free from bias, on the Congressional Record Daily Digest podcast. Subscribe on your favorite podcast platform and discover the process from the heart of U.S. politics. The Congressional Record Daily Digest, an Electricast production.
Electricast.
Hey, heard you like podcasts. Well, check out Dollar Bets. Two sports guys with faces for radio, betting live money against each other on air. That's Dollar Bets with a Z. Find us on the Winner's Edge.